Between 2025 and 2026, the streets of Manila once again caught fire with outrage. Thousands of protesters marched, demanding the ouster of the country's top leaders and denouncing what they called a rotten system of corruption and state violence. At the center of this specific wave of public frustration sits the president, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. Locked in a bitter feud with the president is Vice President Sara Duterte. Their dynastic rivalry currently dominates national headlines, playing out with the spectacle and drama of a primetime soap opera. For 70 years, the Philippines has followed this script. It has ousted dictators, passed sweeping anti-corruption laws, and mobilized millions. Yet the same families invariably maintain control, creating the image of an endless historical loop, where names change, but the system remains identical. Viewing this history as a stagnant loop ignores the friction beneath the surface. Each time a scandal breaks and a movement rises against it, the way Filipinos relate to power changes. If we map these clashes as a spiral, we can begin to see a story of transformation rather than simple repetition. To understand how this engine started, we have to look at the baseline established after independence. Between 1946 and 1965, the country operated on a system where wide-scale political patronage was the expected norm. This era was governed by utang na loob, a deep debt of gratitude. In this system, political favors were treated as social obligations. When a politician provided a government job or a contract to an ally, they weren't just being corrupt, they were fulfilling a cultural expectation to the oligarchy that supported them. The anti-corruption probes of this period functioned largely as political theater. They were rituals of investigation designed to appease public guilt without actually disrupting the status quo. No high-level official was ever successfully prosecuted for graft, and for the most part, the public accepted this as the price of doing business. During these decades, corruption wasn't an anomaly to be eradicated. It was the structural glue that held the entire political system together. This thesis of tolerated patronage was destroyed when Ferdinand Marcos Sr. took power. He centralized corruption, moving away from traditional democratic favors toward a direct authoritarian dictatorship where all wealth flowed through the palace. Working with his wife, Imelda, the regime accumulated a fortune estimated between $5 and $10 billion, looting the state coffers and the central bank's gold stocks. This regime introduced a level of shamelessness, makapalang muka nila, that breached the country's moral economy. While average citizens sold blood to buy rice, and families watched their homes bulldozed for luxury projects, the first couple was itemizing Picassos, solid gold Rolexes, and Renaissance-style townhouses in Manhattan. The public's tolerance reached its breaking point in the early 1980s. Following the assassination of a major opposition leader, millions poured into the streets for his funeral, leading to a moment of national intolerance that would eventually force the Marcoses to flee the country forever. The scale of the plunder during the Marcos years changed the stakes of Philippine politics forever. Corruption had transformed from a functional tool of patronage into an existential threat that the public was no longer willing to forgive. After 1986, the country entered a period of hypervigilance. The government and the middle class adopted a new, rigid model of anti-corruption, heavily influenced by Western economic frameworks that viewed corruption as a generic social problem to be excised like a tumor. This rigid framework struggled on the ground, where the reality of descarte, making ends meet through survival tactics, remained necessary for most Filipinos. The new laws demanded a level of purity that ignored the messy, local logic of how the society actually functioned. This puritanical fervor peaked in 2001, when President Joseph Estrada was ousted, following revelations that illegal gambling money was being delivered directly to his house in palm leaf bags. The massive crowds of People Power II reflected an intense moral outrage, appearing to fulfill the promise that no leader was above the law. However, as successive clean administrations failed to solve systemic poverty or stop the return of familiar dynasties, a sense of historical exhaustion began to set in. The euphoria of the ouster was replaced by a slow, creeping disappointment. Imposing an impossible standard of political purity didn't cure the system. Instead, it slowly convinced the public that democratic reform itself was a hollow promise. This exhaustion leads to anti-corruption fundamentalism, a paralyzing cynicism that emerges when impossible political ideals continuously fail to change the reality on the ground. That cynicism created a vacuum that was filled in 2016. Rodrigo Duterte won by abandoning the rhetoric of moral purity entirely, promising instead to use brute strength and stability to bypass a political system people no longer trusted. In the 2022 election, voters chose a perceived strongman continuity over the good governance platform of Leni Robredo. The appeals to clean, honest government failed to resonate with a majority that had grown tired of 30 years of unfulfilled reformist promises. It is tempting to see the return of the Marcos name and the rise of the Duterte dynasty as a total failure of the state. But instead, these are the signs of a society actively negotiating the realistic boundaries of its own identity, trying to find a version of politics that fits the reality of the Philippines, rather than a theoretical ideal. The history of the Philippines shows us that the biggest threat isn't the persistence of corruption. It is the fundamentalist cynicism that tells citizens their messy, difficult struggle for modernization is a lost cause. The engine of change is still moving. It's just far louder and messier than the models predicted.